Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all back for this new calendar year. Wish you a happy new year and hope your holiday season was pleasant, relaxing, and joyful. Or if you were in a situation like mine where my in-laws came into town, I hope your return to work is pleasant and peaceful and relaxing. Okay, it's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome back a friend and colleague of many years, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, as this afternoon's Grand Round Speaker. Stuart has a joint appointment as a professor in the departments of anesthesiology and psychology. He also serves as the the associate director of the Center of Consciousness, and he was one of the co-founders back in November of 1999. Additionally, he has organized several symposia titled Toward a Science of Consciousness, the Tucson Discussions and Debates, which have since, along with Al Kazniak of Psychology, been published in book form. He has additionally either authored or edited books on biomolecular consciousness and nanotechnology. These topics are additionally represented in numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals and also in book chapters. He is the organizer of the Quantum Mind 2003 Conference on Consciousness, Quantum Physics, and the Brain, to be held in March of this year. Is that going to be here on main campus? The Convention Center, okay. He was the leader of a prior internet course entitled Consciousness at the Millennium, Quantum Approaches to Understanding the Mind. He is the recipient of several grants from the Fetzer Institute, the National Science Foundation, and other groups to study consciousness. He also has attained celebrity status, having appeared in 2 BBC shows, a PBS show, the Discovery Channel, and in several documentary films. This afternoon, Dr. Hameroff's talk is entitled, How Does the Brain Produce Consciousness? Stuart?
Thank you very much, John. Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to address you, a group of psychiatrists who deal with the mind directly and kind of fine-tune it. As an anesthesiologist, I take a more blunt approach, you might say. So me talking to you is kind of like a house painter talking to a group of artists, I think. My interest in consciousness preceded my choice of anesthesiology, actually, and I've been interested in it for a number of years. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I think about it now. And I'm not going to start off by defining consciousness, although I think I will as I go along. There are many stories about conferences and talks where they set out to define it and wind up spending the entire time with a definition. So we'll just dispense with that, and I think you'll understand what I mean by consciousness, and of course, you know what you mean by consciousness. Anyway, David Chalmers is a philosopher here at the University of Arizona. He's probably the leading young philosopher of mind in the world. And he joined our Center for Consciousness group a few years ago and is a professor in philosophy. He's become famous for defining what he called the hard problem of consciousness, which is actually a restatement of an issue that goes back to the Greeks, but he did it very well and cleverly. Basically, first he starts off by the easy problems, which really are not so easy. The ability to discriminate, categorize, and react to environmental stimuli, the integration of information by a cognitive system, reportability of mental states, the ability of the system to access its own internal states, focusing attention, control of behavior, and the difference between wakefulness and sleep. And I might add the difference between wakefulness and anesthesia, which is different from sleep. If you're asleep and someone takes a knife to you, you're going to notice it. But under anesthesia, you wouldn't. Now, any of these, I think, aberrations of any of these easy problems would probably warrant a psych consult. And, but they're still relatively easy compared to the hard problem. The really hard problem, according to Dave and others, is that of subjective phenomenal experience. The smell of a rose, the sound of an oboe, the felt quality of emotion, and the experience of a stream of conscious thought. We have an inner life. We have something inside of us that gives us experience, and presumably robots and machines do not. As far as animals, that's another topic. I think they do, although it's certainly different. So this inner life. And philosophers describe this experience as being comprised of qualia. Qualia are sort of the raw components of conscious experience. It's kind of like a painter with a palette where the individual simple colors on the palette are the qualia, and he or she puts it together to give a complex painting. So our complex, rich experience is comprised of simple, fundamental qualia. So you may see that word. And philosophers have also come up with probably hypothetical construct called a zombie, who is someone who may look and act like us but doesn't have any consciousness. And this is a useful philosophical tool. And Dave and I also developed the zombie blues, which is usually performed late night in the bars at consciousness conferences. Some of you may have heard it. Well, in addition to the easy problems, there's some other rather difficult problems. I mentioned the hard problem, number one. And there's also the binding problem. Why and how disparate brain processes are unified into single objects, a sense of unified self. If you look at an object, my finger, for example, there's different shape, color, meaning, and so forth. They're processed, presumably different parts of your brains, but it all comes together to tell you what it is. Similarly, there's only one of us, at least most of us have only one entity, conscious self inside of us, the so-called unitary self. Another problem is the transition from preconscious or subconscious processes to consciousness itself. The same brain regions may be subconscious at one moment and manifest consciousness at another, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. Consciousness is really the tip of an iceberg. The problem of free will or non-computability, if we indeed have free will, I think we do. I don't have any choice but to believe that. And subjective flow of time in physics outside of consciousness, there really isn't an arrow of time. This is a very interesting problem. And I went to a conference about this in Europe, about the physics and geometry and psychology of time. And finally, the problem of non-locality spatially and temporally, if you believe in things like ESP and whatnot. And there are some interesting data about that. Well, the scientific study of consciousness sort of started a couple hundred years ago with phrenology, believe it or not. Francis Gall came up with this mapping of various properties inside our brains based on cadaver studies and then looking back at what the person was like historically. And it was the first attempt to kind of map function of the brain or map areas of the brain to cognitive function. And you may have seen cartoon takeoffs of this where a dog has a huge lobe for scratching and sniffing and rolling and bad stuff and whatnot. But this all stems from this fellow. Now, of course, we have our fantastic brain imaging techniques, and we are actually able to localize various functions. This is an image from the group at Irvine who studied PET and fMRI under anesthesia in awake patients and then sort of subtracted. And these are the areas they find that differ the most, thalamus and cortical projections, which goes with a lot of theories about thalamocortical projections being responsible for consciousness. But this raises a paradox because localization versus distribution. Stemming from phrenology, we know that, and now with a huge amount of evidence about focal deficits, specialized functions, hemispheric dominance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, specific functions are localized in specific regions of the brain. However, on the other hand, Carl Lashley, who set out as a localizationalist, if you will, trying to find the location of memory and other things, discovered that he couldn't and concluded that certain activities dependent on definite cortical areas can be carried out by any part, and that memory is distributed. It's all over the place. Now we know about neuroplasticity, global coherence, unity of self. Pribram proposed the holographic brain to explain this, and we have the binding problem of everything being bound together. So we have this paradox of localization versus distribution. We also have some other paradoxes, such as we know the brain utilizes both parallel and serial processing. And analogous to neural network computers, feedback versus feed-forward networks, hierarchical systems versus hierarchical systems, and bottom-up processes versus bottom-down processes, or top-down processing, excuse me. All of these things are going on in our brains. Now, a heterarchical versus hierarchical system might look something like this. This is from Crick and Koch, who have several interesting takes on the problem of consciousness. And it's a hierarchy, but with all this cross-connection, it's really what's called a heterarchy. And you can kind of summarize by saying everything seems to be connected to everything, almost. So it gets rather confusing. There must be some underlying order or principle, but nobody seems to know what. Well, how do we explain all this? There's a number of different approaches. Probably if you took a vote or a poll among scientists and philosophers worldwide, most would fall into A, which and I've merged actually several subvarieties: functionalism, computationalism, emergence. The basic idea is that the brain is a computer, that neurons and synapses act as bits or switches in a computer, and that through computational complexity and interactions among all these 10 to the 11th neurons, consciousness emerges as a novel property. Emergence is a term from nonlinear dynamics, which refers to the fact that you can get new properties in a hierarchy from fairly simple low-level interactions give rise to complex property. Wetness is an emergent property of individual water molecules. Weather storms, the great red spot of Jupiter, hurricanes and tornadoes are emergent properties of dust and air molecules interacting at a simple level. Candle flame is an emergent phenomenon. B would be dualism. Consciousness lies outside science, and there are many proponents of this. C stems from the Greek idea of panpsychism, that everything has some component of consciousness. Pan-protopsychism, pan-experientialism, or fundamentalism, if you'll pardon that pun, that consciousness or its precursors, proto-conscious precursors, are irreducible components of the universe, like mass, spin, or charge. They're just a given. They're just there. And we don't know why or how they got there, but they are. And somewhat related to this is the more spiritual ideas of the Buddhist universal mind, Jung's collective unconscious, Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere, David Bohm, who was a quantum physicist's implicate order, Penrose's Platonic realm, although he didn't mean it in a spiritual way. And there's some new ideas about quantum computation in the brain, which I'll get to later, and F, all of the above. And I personally think that all of these are valid, with the proviso that dualism refers to consciousness outside present science. We need to make some advances in terms of physics and biology. But what's wrong with the emergence idea? What's wrong with functionalism, computationalism, and emergence? First of all, there's no threshold for emergence nor testable predictions. If consciousness emerges at a critical level of computational complexity, there should be some equation, some formula, some idea of at what level consciousness will emerge, and there's none. Emergent phenomena abound in nature: weather patterns, candle flames, computer programs, yet they aren't conscious. Of course, I have to put a question mark there because I can't prove that they're not conscious. And I can't prove that you are conscious, and you can't prove that I'm conscious. Consciousness is unobservable. I'm not sure that's a good thing or not. It's a problem in anesthesia because we can't tell 100% that our patients are not conscious. So consciousness is unobservable, but presumably weather patterns and other emergent properties are not. These types of explanations, which are often AI hype, artificial intelligence hype, and AI people usually promise consciousness to government funding agencies to get another $100 billion worth of grants for the next 10 years so that we can have a conscious computer to run all our fancy military equipment and so forth. I'm being a little unfair, but not too bad. And others try to explain away or trivialize the problem. Dan Dennett's famous book, Consciousness Explained, was really a kind of a postmodern deconstruction of consciousness into little itty-bitty this and that don't amount to anything. Or they use bait and swap techniques. You'll read a paper, My Theory of Consciousness, this is how consciousness works, and you go through a whole long thing, and you find out at the end they're talking about reportability or memory or attention or something else, not really the hard problem. 4 is the fact that neurons and synapses are extremely complex, unlikely to function merely as single switches. For example, a single-cell organism like paramecium can learn, avoid predators, find food, mates, and have a sex life without any synapses. It's just a single cell. So if a paramecium can do that, surely neurons are at least equally complicated, I would hope. Finally, the standard membrane-based model of the neuron, based on ion channels, fluxes, mediating voltage gradients, is dubious. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. This is based on some very interesting work by Gerald Pollack. But first, let me talk about number 4. Here's a paramecium. It's going to bounce into something, retreat, and go in another direction, all based on these cytoskeletal ciliary structures. And it can find a mate and merge with it and have a sex life, and it doesn't have any synapse. It's just a single cell. It can also learn. If you put it in a capillary tube and let it escape and put it back, it'll get out quicker each time you do that. It does it with its internal cytoskeletal structure, and neurons have a similar, even more complicated cytoskeletal structure. That is kind of not just the skeletal support system, but some of us believe the nervous system within the cell also. We'll come back to that. And this is what the inside of a dendrite actually looks like. It's not a bag of water, but a highly ordered network of its own, kind of like a fractal subdimension, a network within a network, or a forest within a tree, as somebody called it. Okay, let's get to Pollack's work. And I was taught in medical school, and I'm sure everybody was taught pretty much about these ion channels and the membrane runs everything and so forth. And it's based on some rather dubious assumptions. If you look at the very, very top, A, this is a patch clamp where a pipette has a piece of membrane and measuring voltage across it. And you get these little blips of voltage. So these are thought to be ion conductances. Well, it turns out if you put a silicon rubber patch, you get the same thing. And if you put a polyethylene filter, you get very much the same thing. And if you put a pure lipid bilayer without any proteins, you get a very similar thing. So it's not ion channels opening and closing. Something else is going on. Also, if you take a cell, punch it full of holes with electricity or detergent, so that all of the potassium should leak out, all of the sodium should leak in, it should die pretty quickly, but it doesn't. It hangs around for quite a long time. And in fact, you can use detergent, take the membrane off completely, and it still does fairly well for a while because of the gel structure of the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is not a bag of water with things floating around like a minestrone soup. This is actually a schematic of all of the structure inside a cell. That stripe would be the membrane, and then all the other structures are proteins which make up the structure inside of a cell. So there's not that much room for the water. There is water in the spaces. But because of all this surface, what happens is the water gets ordered. And because there's charges on all these protein surfaces, and the waters form something like, it's not really a crystal, it's not like ice, but it's not really aqueous bulk water either. It's somewhere in between, a pseudocrystal, if you will. Now, the reason this is important is that potassium, for example, is soluble in this ordered water, but sodium is not, because sodium is too big, which means that if the water is ordered, it's going to hold the potassium in, and it's going to exclude the sodium. So this could explain why we have this gradient across the cell boundary, irrespective of ion pumps. So if we have a transition in the protein, it's going to disorder the water, and the solubility of the sodium and potassium is going to change, and this can account for fluxes. And Pollack makes a beautiful argument for this, and I recommend his book highly. And by the way, he'll be at the conference that John mentioned in March here in Tucson. Similarly, vesicles, including neurotransmitter vesicles and so forth, can also be accounted for by the same type of mechanism. So what about receptors? A lot of psychiatry and anesthesia is based on drug effects on receptors, which presumably open ion channels. Well, his story is that if you look at the bottom, we have transmembrane proteins which undergo conformational change in the top and flip and carry ions with them. So the ions don't fall through a hole, they're actually flip with the protein as it flips back and forth across the membrane. Now, I actually wrote a review of Pollack's book for Amazon because I liked it so much, and I said something like, if this book doesn't get burned, it's going to be a classic, because it's so heretical that I think a lot of people are not going to like it. But I sort of thought there was something fishy about this whole story, and this book gives a good argument that there may indeed be. Similarly, if something like acetylcholine binds to a receptor, there are ionotropic receptors that open ion channels, or supposedly open ion channels, and also metabotropic receptors that have direct connections inside the cell to the cytoskeleton. And Nancy Wolf and I, in a paper in Trends in Cognitive Science, described acetylcholine decoupling the microtubules from the membrane by these actin bridges, which would serve to promote a quantum state, which I'll get to later. The point is that metabotropic receptors are as important as ionotropic receptors, and by direct effects into the cell itself. If we just think of the cell as a gel system rather than as a membrane, as a bag of water surrounded by a membrane, and just look at the gel characteristics, we get some very interesting stimuli response characteristics. These are pure gels, not even biological gels, just gels. pH, temperature, chemical, biochemical agents, solvents and salts, electrical field, electromagnetic radiation, mechanical stress, elicit all these responses: chemical, phase separation, shape change, surface, permeability, mechanical, optical, and electrical changes. So the gel characteristics of cells may be extremely important, and they've been eclipsed by everybody focusing on the membrane, and for good reason. The membrane is certainly important. But I think in the future we're going to see a lot more emphasis on this. Well, that brings us to the question of drug action, and psychiatric drugs and so forth are extremely important, SSRIs and many, many others. This is from Feldman's Fundamentals of Neuropsychopharmacology, listing 7 sites for drug action, psychiatric drug action. And I'm going to skip ahead and give you the numbers. 1 are microtubules, which are inside the cell. I showed you those before. 2 would be the excitable membranes, including the proteins. 3 sites for synthesis, sites for active uptake, such as the SSRIs. And I've always been curious why antidepressants, the reuptake or uptake effect is immediate as far as I understand, but the clinical effect takes weeks to months, if not longer. And someone explained that what happens is the cytoskeleton, which after all regulates and controls the sensitivity of the synapse, gets restructured, and it takes that long for it to be reprogrammed and restructured. So it's the cytoskeleton in the cytoplasmic gel system which is controlling the synaptic strength and whatnot, which accounting for the delayed effect of SSRIs and other drugs. Amphetamines, on the other hand, and cocaine and whatnot are most likely immediate effects, because that effect indeed is mediated by prolonged catechols in the synapse. And agonists, antagonists, organelles, and so forth. So the point is that it's not all receptors, and we need anesthetics. I should mention. For many years, we thought to work. Most of the century, we thought to work in the lipid part of the membrane because their potency is directly correlated with solubility in the lipid environment. But in the 1980s, it was discovered that anesthetics work directly on proteins, ion channels, receptors, and other proteins, and that there are pockets within proteins that are lipid-like, called hydrophobic pockets. And it turns out that the anesthetics act by affecting quantum mechanical events in these little hydrophobic pockets, which are something like the brain of the protein, if you will. So we know that inhibits consciousness, the anesthetic gases. And the story is still open on a lot of other drugs. But it's not strictly agonist-antagonist at receptors. It's a bit more complicated than that. And probably at least secondary effects on the cytoplasm and cytoskeleton. The other question, another question, is upon what level of brain organization does consciousness critically depend? Well, most of the emergence people would say neurons are the fundamental bits. But you might also say, well, brain regions, for example, prefrontal cortex has certainly an executive function. Neural network coherence, we know that the best correlation electrophysiologically is with a coherent 40 hertz gamma frequency. Particularly neurotransmitter systems, acetylcholine seems important, at least in attention. Collective synaptic activity, ionotropic, metabotropic, and also electrotonic. There are many gap junctions in the brain, these electrotonic portals between cells, which, and it turns out that the 40 hertz oscillations are mediated by gap junction electrical conductivity, electrotonic activity, rather than any chemical, accounting for the almost perfect phase coherence across the brain of 40 hertz. Other people look at axonal membrane spike trains as the currency of consciousness, if you will. Also dendritic fields, the electrical fields around the dendrites, which mediate EEG, or intracellular processes, second messengers, cytoskeleton effects, and so forth. and quantum coherent processes, for example, those in the cytoskeleton. So all of these may have some effect or role. Well, this is a partial list of theories or neural correlates of consciousness from modified from one of Dave Chalmers' papers. He calls it the zoo, like the particle zoo of consciousness theories. Some of them are just neural correlates or cognitive correlates. A few of them attempt to actually explain the hard problem and other problems. Perhaps the best known, or one of them, is Crick and Kolk's idea of 40 hertz oscillations in cerebral cortex, because it does seem to correlate best. And we have some anatomical things like activity in intralaminar nucleus in the thalamus, reentrant loops in thalamocortical system by Gerald Edelman, 40 hertz activity in thalamocortical systems, activity in nuclear reticularis, extended reticular thalamic activity, Newman and Bars, anterior cingulate system, neural assemblies bound by NMDA receptors, Ben Libet's idea of temporally extended neural activity, back projections to lower cortex, extrastriate, prefrontal projections. Crick and Kolk think that visual consciousness does not occur in V1, but actually is projected to prefrontal areas where it becomes conscious, and they have some evidence for that. Neural activity in area V5. Beck and Eccles, John Eccles, the Nobel laureate in neurophysiology, in his later years got into the problem of consciousness and adopted a quantum approach with Frederick Beck. Eccles was actually a dualist, and his idea was that the part outside science or God or whatever he was thinking acted at synapses by this quantum indeterminacy problem. Beck is not a dualist, but thinks that quantum indeterminacy happens at synapses. Walker has this old idea of quantum tunneling through synapses going back to actually to 1970. Logothetis and Schall actually did some extremely interesting, exquisite experiments with monocular rivalry in monkeys to basically what they did. Well, actually, I'm going to show you a little data from there in a second, so we'll come back to that. Susan Greenfield's neuronal gestalts, Jeffrey Gray's comparator system. In 1994, I published the idea that quantum coherence in microtubules was the substrate of consciousness. Bernie Barr's global workspace, thalamocortical global workspace, activated memories, and so forth. Roger Penrose, in 1989, wrote a book called The Emperor's New Mind, where he suggested that our conscious minds did things which were non-computable, non-algorithmic. That allowed us to be different from computers. And the only source of this non-computability was a type of quantum collapse of the quantum wave function based on quantum gravity. And I'll come back to this idea a little bit later, but it's certainly quite different from most of the others. Ian Marshall, in 1989, suggested a Bose-Einstein condensation of brain receptors, and Bose-Einstein condensates were actually proposed by Bose and Einstein in the 1930s and then realized in the lab in the 1980s or 90s. Basically a condensation of a coherent state where all the members become unified. And he proposed it as a solution to the binding problem. In 1995, Roger Penrose and I published the first of a series of articles suggesting that his quantum gravity objective reduction occurred in the microtubules in the brain. I'll come back to that later. Others have suggested electromagnetic fields in the brain are consciousness. I mentioned emergence complexity arguments. Al Scott, who used to be here at Arizona, and a number of others. Carl Pribram in 1972, The Brain is Hologram, which had some interesting appeal. And anatomically, Nancy Wolf and I published in Intrinsic Cognitive Science the idea that rather than this ascending system of consciousness was in this horizontal syncytium of dendrites interconnected by gap junctions oscillating at 40 hertz. I mentioned Logothetis' work, and they did some very interesting studies in monkeys. They trained these monkeys to look at metastable objects like Necker cubes, so that you look at this thing which could be, I forgot to make a slide of it, but I'm sure you've seen it, where the surface could be back or forward. And our perception, our conscious perception, goes back and forth between the two. And they trained the monkeys to somehow report which one they were seeing, and then they had electrodes to see, and they found this sulcus region. I forget already what it was. Superior temporal sulcus activity. showed the actual, whichever one they were reporting. So visual cortex had both, and then whichever one, and it flipped back and forth in this superior temporal sulcus. A very beautiful neural correlate of consciousness. I also mentioned the work that Nancy Wolf and I did about this horizontal syncytium, and she also had the idea that we start with the pyramidal cell in black with these sort of lateral dendritic connections to other dendrites, pyramidal dendrites by gap junctions shown in the insert, also interconnected by GABA interneurons, which pace the coherent 40 hertz. And we have thalamocortical inputs, which in her idea, her original idea, bring the raw material from the visual field or sensory field in. And then the basilocortical cholinergic inputs kind of selected from that field for conscious attention, kind of like plucking the strings of a harp, if you will, to produce consciousness. So that everything was there from the thalamocortical input, but the cholinergic basilocortical inputs, by this decoupling mechanism eliciting a quantum state inside the neurons, selected which of the content, possible content, would come into consciousness. So that's in that reference. It's also on my website. Let me address a few specific issues. Unconscious versus conscious processes. Most of what the brain does is non-conscious. Crick and Koch, for example, estimate that at any one time only 100 to 1,000 neurons are necessary for consciousness. And they have some evidence for that. Consciousness is the tip of an iceberg. Many lines of evidence indicate that the same neurons or brain regions are at one moment non-conscious and another moment conscious. There's no grandfather neuron or grandmother neuron where the signals goes to one place and lights up, and that's consciousness. That's not it. There's some the same neurons become conscious somehow, but we don't know what the transition or threshold is. From dreams, unconscious processes can be characterized to some extent, and Carl Jung remarked that unconscious processes involve pure feelings. I found this very interesting quote from Mate Blanco, who described unconscious processes as where paradox reigns and opposites merge into sameness. And if you think about your dreams, this may make some sense. I found that to be a very interesting quote, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. Along these lines, I was interested to find out in preparing for this talk that Freud seems to be making a comeback. As you well know, he identified unconscious drives, aggression and libido, evident in dreams, which shape our behavior. However, these drives have been downplayed in favor of rational conscious processes, and dreams characterized as random mental static, if you will. I've always wanted to disagree with that because I always kind of liked what my dreams seem to be telling me. Anyway, Jack Panksepp, a neuroscientist at Bowling Green, who was at one of our consciousness conferences, found that stimulating a certain area, the ventral tegmental area in rats, caused a generalized seeking response. And others generalized this to the drives, looking for action, if you will. They weren't hungry. I don't know if they were bored. They were just looking to do something. They were driven. Using brain imaging techniques, Mark Solms found this same area, which is related anatomically to limbic and forebrain regions, the key to dreaming. So even though the area responsible for REM, that may just be the trigger, and that these areas that are responsible for emotion and drives are active in dreaming. So Solms remarked that Panksepp discovered as a neuroscientist what Freud had discovered psychologically. And now more commonly referred to as emotions, the modern suite of drives comprise rage, panic, separation, distress, lust, and a variation of libido, sometimes called seeking. This is from a poster presented at the Tucson conference from a Argentine psychiatrist, actually, called Freud's Take on Consciousness Revisited. And basically, her idea was that the red below the threshold, the drives, once they reached this threshold, became conscious, and psychic images appeared above a certain threshold. I thought this was kind of interesting and consistent with what previous scientists had discovered. Well, I'm going to turn out to what I think, and hopefully, in my mind anyway, kind of ties it all together. And that's to talk about quantum physics. And this is where usually people fall asleep or don't want to deal with it, because as Richard Feynman said, anybody who claims to understand quantum physics is either lying or crazy, because it is truly, truly bizarre. For example, in the quantum world, particles can exist in multiple possible states or locations simultaneously. There's wave-particle duality, or what's called quantum superposition. Things can be smeared out over space and time. Schrodinger's cat is a thought experiment, which the cat being both dead and alive at the same time, which illustrated this possibility. And we know this happens. We know that this happens at the small scale. The question is, how small is small, and at what level does our classical, real, definite classical world appear? Another property is that once unified, quantum particles may remain connected over distances. This is quantum non-locality or entanglement, otherwise known as Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen effect, or Bell's inequalities. This has been shown experimentally. You have a spin-up, spin-down system, and they're both in superposition of both. You send one along a fiber optic cable 50 miles this way, one 50 miles this way. You measure one here, and it's spin up. The other one immediately is going to spin down, because they're paired, even though they're both in both until observed. And this is actually the basis of what's called quantum cryptography and quantum teleportation. This is actually being used technologically as is quantum computation. In quantum computation, we have quantum bits. Now, bits in a classical computer are 1 or 0, one or the other. In quantum computers, the bits can be in superposition of both 1 and 0, or qubits, quantum bits. While in this state, they interact, compute non-locally by this weird entanglement, and then, at a certain point, they all collapse and choose one or the other. And while they're communicating by entanglement, they're actually processing and able to do incredibly complex and efficient quantum computation. Now, the boundary between the quantum and classical worlds, the quantum state reduction, or the collapse of the wave function, remains mysterious, which is why Schrodinger's cat story is still around. How big must the quantum system be before it will spontaneously collapse? If it's isolated from the environment. If you expose it to the environment, it will decohere. Because of that, historically, people thought consciousness collapsed the wave function. It was open the box, look at the cat, and it shows either dead or alive. But that's probably not true either. Anyway, just a couple things about quantum information, because I predict you'll be hearing more about this. There's probably going to be a technological revolution. As I mentioned, information is represented as quantum superposition, which interact by non-local entanglement. It was originally suggested in the 80s by Benioff, Feynman, and David Deutsch, and Benioff will be here for the Quantum Mind Conference. In the early 90s, Peter Shor at Bell Labs showed that, mathematically, that if they could be produced, they could do things like factoring large numbers into prime exponentially faster, which would make all military and bank codes obsolete, because that's the basis of cryptography. So governments and industries started pouring a lot of money into it. Recently, they've been shown to be able to employ search and pattern recognition algorithms also. The problem was that they were very sensitive and could be decohered by a stray cosmic ray, they thought, or any thermal vibration. But they developed quantum error correction algorithms which could deal with the decoherence problem. Presently, prototypes exist. It looks like they're going to be able to be built in silicon, so they can be mass-produced. So would they be conscious? Would quantum computers be conscious? Not exactly. So what's this quantum mind idea? Well, in a nutshell, consider this. Let's just say that the preconscious or the unconscious or the Freudian even subconscious is information in quantum superposition, quantum information, multiple possibilities coexisting, where paradox reigns and opposites merge to sameness. That was the quote about the unconscious, but it applies beautifully to quantum superposition. Then quantum state reduction, or the collapse of the wave function, in which the multiple possibilities choose definite classical states, is a conscious moment, or what the philosopher Whitehead called an occasion of experience. A sequence of these moments would give a stream of consciousness. So how could this possibly occur in the brain? This is from 1994, after the first Tucson conference, and a group of us went to the Grand Canyon, and the man in the yellow is Roger Penrose. And I had been working on information processing and microtubules for about 20 years, but couldn't figure out how, even if they were computers, how they could produce consciousness. Then I read his book about the quantum gravity, which I didn't really understand, but intuitively I thought he was onto something, but he didn't have a very good site or substrate for quantum gravity computation. So I contacted him and suggested that maybe the microtubules I was studying might be the key, might be his site, and he In other words, he had the mechanism and I had the structure. So we got together, I invited him to the conference, and we went on this hike through the Grand Canyon. And by Indian Gardens, we were pretty delirious, and we really were able to make a lot of headway. Anyway, recall what the interior of the cell looks like. It's made of these microtubules, which actually, at least if you have an imagination, kind of look like computer lattice. They're cylindrical, made of a lattice of individual proteins which can switch back and forth. So my original idea, dating back to the 80s, was that these were like automata computers where the state of each one influenced the neighbors and were influenced by the neighbors, and this processed information. This could give you a huge amount of computational complexity for every cell. But even so, it didn't really help with the problem of consciousness. This is what I had come up with, the idea that this is a piece of a microtubule with the blue and the white representing different conformational states, and by dipole-dipole interactions, patterns emerged and moved, and you could do actually classical, or the simulations were able to do classical computation, and I proposed this as a classical computer mechanism inside living cells. But again, it didn't really explain consciousness. So Roger and I got together and we decided, well, maybe the tubulin switching was like a qubit or quantum bit. So if you look in the middle at the top, just the black and the white would be the classical tubulin switching between two classical states. But maybe we thought the tubulin could also be in a quantum superposition of both possible states. And the reason, in which case it could act as a qubit, interact with all the others, and act like a quantum computer. And the reason that might be true is that what actually controls protein conformational dynamics, whether it's an ion channel opening or an enzyme or a receptor or a tubulin, are hydrophobic quantum mechanical forces in these hydrophobic pockets called London dispersion forces. And I knew about these because this is exactly how anesthetics work. Anesthetic gases get into these hydrophobic pockets and inhibit the quantum mechanical interactions and therefore stop the protein from working and therefore block consciousness. So these are the weakest but most numerous, and they mediate anesthetic effects. And since they couple to the protein conformational dynamics, we proposed that proteins could act as qubits. So we came up with the idea that the microtubules inside neurons, dendrites in particular, were quantum bits, and that the microtubules were part of a quantum computing network inside cells. And that the quantum information got from neuron to neuron across gap junctions, something like this, and that the microtubule-associated proteins kind of tuned the quantum states, kind of like frets in a guitar. So we came up with the name of our model, orchestrated objective reduction. Objective reduction being the type of collapse Roger suggested, which would terminate the quantum state to choose the classical states in orchestration by the biological feedback mechanism. So basically, the idea was that the classical states would go into a quantum superposition shown as in gray, and in the quantum superposition would reach a threshold that Roger had described by quantum gravity between step 6 and 7, and collapse and choose some classical states, something like this. So you see the three pieces of microtubules where we get emergence of quantum superposition, and we reach this threshold. There's a conscious moment, a now, if you will. The collapse occurs, we have a flash of conscious experience, and the cycle begins again, and this could happen every 25 milliseconds, or roughly 40 times a second, for example, 40 hertz. It could actually, depending on how many were involved, it could happen at various frequencies. This looks, pardon my extrapolation, trying to get Freud on my side, but this looks a little like this idea of reaching a threshold from subconscious and then into consciousness, which is kind of what we're saying. Cognitively, this might work something like this. Say you're walking down the street and you see a woman's face. You sort of recognize her. Is it Amy, Betty, or Carol? But you're not sure, so you have a quantum superposition of all three possibilities, and finally you recognize, aha, it's Carol, and you have this conscious moment. Oh, hi, Carol. Or you're trying to decide what to have for dinner, shrimp, sushi, or pasta. You have a quantum superposition of all possibilities, and for some reason, you're not sure why, but okay, you'll have sushi. Now, obviously, this could be done by classical algorithmic processes, but there's some significant advantages of it being a quantum computation. So a series of these collapses or reductions or moments, say every 25 milliseconds, on the top would be normal experience, and B would be anesthesia, just blocks it all together. You just don't have any consciousness. If you're excited or enchanted for some reason, you have an increased slope, and you have more conscious events per time. So the outward world would slow down, if you will. And the height of the collapse is greater, so you have more intense experiences. In an altered state of whatever kind, you might actually go into the quantum state and not reach threshold, so that you would merge your consciousness with what's normally subconscious in the subconscious phase. And dreaming might look something like that. Now, time is another very strange thing. In the quantum world, there's time indeterminacy. Between collapses, time goes neither forward nor backwards, but it's kind of smeared out. And there's some data that non-conscious processes can actually go backwards in time. And if we have time later, I'll discuss that, because it's kind of interesting. So this is what a conscious moment would look like, or a series of them giving rise to consciousness with quantum information being able to go backwards. So the pre-conscious quantum superposition is under the curve, and then you have a series of conscious moments. Okay, well, let's say this is true. Why would it be conscious? What about the heart problem? Why do you smell a rose and hear an oboe, feel love or whatever? Well, a philosopher, this goes back to pan-protopsychism and merging with modern physics. Whitehead said that consciousness is a sequence of events or occasions occurring in a wider field of proto-conscious experience. A philosopher named Abner Shimoni made the comment that Whitehead's occasions are analogous, perhaps identical, to quantum state reductions. Could quantum state reductions occur in the brain? Well, I think they can, by the mechanism I just showed you. But what about the wider field? Well, maybe it's the universe itself. Is proto-conscious experience an irreducible property of reality, like mass, spin, or charge? What is reality? What is empty space? What is this? Well, it's actually fundamental space-time geometry, which relates to quantum gravity. So what am I talking about? That's probably a very good question at this point. Well, what is thin air? What is actually empty space? This is kind of interesting. If you start with A, that's the size of a protein, a tubulin, if you will, and highlighted are the tryptophans. And then in B, we have an atom, 10 to the minus 8 centimeters. And let's say we're going to go down below the scale of atoms. And don't ask me how they know this, but physicists have looked at this. And as you go down and down in scale, everything is smooth until you finally reach a bottom level at what's called the Planck scale, where there's a pattern, there's information. It's 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. As John Wheeler said, it's kind of like looking from an airplane at the surface of the ocean. It looks very smooth. But if you were on the ocean in a boat, it'd be very choppy. There's information there. So the Planck scale is described by, you take your pick, string theory or quantum gravity or loop quantum gravity, spin networks, what have you. But the point is that there is information there. And it's non-local, it's interconnected all over the place. And Penrose said that this is where Platonic values reside. And then we came up, well, why not qualia? Maybe proto-conscious qualia are patterns embedded at this fundamental level. These quantum processes in the brain come along and access them and select them. Well, how would that happen? Well, Roger also addressed the issue that nobody else wanted to touch, of what quantum superposition actually is. How can particles be in multiple locations or states simultaneously? And Einstein had said that mass equals curvature in space-time geometry. And Penrose, and also the multiple worlds hypothesis, said that superposition is a simultaneous curvature in alternate directions, a separation or a bubble in space-time geometry at the fundamental level. In the multiple worlds view, every superposition branches off to form a whole new universe. But Roger said, no, these separations are unstable, and after time will collapse and choose one or the other. So it would look something like this. A tubulin in one conformation would be curvature outward towards you, and in the other would be in towards the screen. And a quantum superposition would be a bubble or separation in fundamental space-time geometry. So when it reaches this threshold, it's going to collapse and choose one or the other. So basically, we equated the tubulin qubit with a qubit in fundamental space-time geometry, and he had come up with this equation to predict when the collapse would occur. And we applied it to, I'm going to come to this in a second, we applied it to the brain, and for 40 milliseconds, it turned out basically roughly 1,000 to 10,000 neurons, the amount of tubulin in 1,000 to 10,000 neurons, the same number that Crick and Kolk had come up with. So, but the basic idea is that qualia are actually fundamental patterns in space-time geometry. So the pattern in her brain, which represents red, is actually the actual redness, both in reality and in her brain, is a pattern in fundamental space-time geometry shown by this cartoon, very simple cartoon version. Actually, it's much denser and more complicated. So to kind of wrap up, you think about the metaphors that we've had for a conscious mind over the thousands of years. The ancient Greeks said memory was a seal ring in wax. That's how memory was formed. In the 19th century, we had minds as a telegraph switching circuit, or the subconscious mind boiling over like a steam engine. In the 20th century, we had conscious mind as a hologram, classical computer. And I'll predict that in the 21st century, we'll be thinking of consciousness as a quantum gravity computer. And this is the conference that John mentioned, Quantum Mind 2003. Penrose will be here, a lot of other people. It's free to U of A people. It's during spring break, although it doesn't apply to those of us who work at the medical center. Here's the website, and you're all welcome to come. And I'll just close there. Thank you very much.
Have any quantum effects been observed at the neuronal level, say, neurotransmissions between, say, synapses across neurons?
Well, you got to be careful because we have this quantum of neurotransmitter vesicle. But ignoring that, Beck and Eccles experimentally proven no. Well, everything at root is a quantum level, but the idea is most people say it gets washed out above a certain level by decoherence. And people scoff at our ideas because they say to build quantum computers, they have to be built at absolute zero to avoid thermal vibration. So how can you have these quantum effects at the warm brain? And the answer, I think, is that evolution is at 4 billion years to solve the problem. And if you go to my website, there's this whole argument about decoherence. And a physicist named Max Tegmark wrote an article about this, claiming that it was impossible that the microtubules would decohere in 10 to the minus 13 seconds. And science picked this up and kind of trumpeted the death of the quantum mind idea. Well, some physicist colleagues and I wrote an article which was published in the same journal, PhysRev, that Tegmark published, showing that given the constraints of our model, well, he actually invented his own microtubule quantum model and shot that down. But using the constraints we had specified, that the decoherence time is in the order of hundreds of milliseconds within the range that we needed. As far as experimental proof, no, not yet, but we have testable predictions. And there's several on my website in the appendix of the paper, appendix of the paper in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society is a list of 20 testable predictions. And that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about at the Quantum Mind Conference, is testable predictions. Roger's going to talk about testable predictions of the objective reduction side. I'm going to talk about the biological side. Richard.
Very nice.
Thank you.
With those testable hypotheses, I'm just wondering, is the quantum theory of consciousness falsifiable? And if so, how would it be falsified?
It's far more falsifiable than any other theory. How would it be falsified? Well, if you could produce consciousness in a purely classical system, the problem there is how do you prove it's conscious, which is a problem for everybody. That's true. I should say that almost all drug receptor interactions are basically a quantum effect at that level. But that's not the same as macroscopic quantum coherence, which is really what I'm saying. So if someone could, if you could produce consciousness with the cytoskeleton inactivated, assuming it's not quantum effects at the membrane, that would invalidate our theory, for example, because we're presuming it's quantum effects in the cytoskeleton. But as far as the emergence theories are not falsifiable, as far as I can tell. I'd say ours is.
In the context of your theory of consciousness, how do you use states like psychosis and dissociation? That's useful to consider.
Well, if you go back to the slide about the altered states, the idea there is, for whatever reason, you don't return to baseline, so you're merging what's normally in the subconscious with what would normally be conscious. So if you think of all the bizarre things in our dreams and whatnot, if that becomes part of our everyday moment-to-moment life, that could qualify as psychosis. And I also might add that there's some interesting data from the 1970s on hallucinogenic drugs by Kang and Green and Saul Snyder, when he was a young guy, who showed that they did something called electron resonance orbital energy, and they showed that they had an analogous series of psychedelic hallucinogens. They found that the potency was proportional to the energy donated to the receptor, suggesting that that the receptor and everything connected to it would be more likely to go into a quantum state. So I think, I take that as some support for the idea that hallucinogens promote a quantum superposition phase.
Do you see any interplay between quantum theory of consciousness and emergence? For example, qubits or being fractals or embedded as an embedded structure?
Well, the collapse itself can be looked at as an emergent phenomenon. I mean, what's emerging is a classical state out of a quantum state. So it's a type of emergence for sure. And also, I think higher levels of consciousness are emergent phenomena. As far as fractals, there's actually going to be an interesting talk at the Quantum Mind Conference about a fractal theory of mind. But it's kind of like and of course, Carl Pribram's also going to be at the conference. He's been talking about a holographic theory, which is basically the same thing. Structurally, the cytoskeletal network within each neuron is kind of like a fractal subdimension of a neural network for us within a tree. So this gives a lot of opportunity for fractal analogies, at least. And there's one guy, Erhard Bieberek, who has a serious fractal model of mind with mathematics and everything.
Have you or others looked into the amount of information stored in brain states? It sounds like your prediction is that the brain can have more possible states.
Right. Yeah, I actually had a slide. I didn't show it. Classically, 10 to the 11th neurons switching, milliseconds, 10,000 synapses gives you about a maximum of 10 to the 15th states per second, which is a lot. And AI people, but we have computers that almost do that, and they're not conscious as far as we can tell. If you say that fundamental switching is occurring at the tubulin level, they switch faster in the nanosecond. There's roughly 10 to the 7th tubulins per neuron switching in the nanosecond region, so that's 10 to the 16th. So you go from 10 to the 15th, you get up into the 10 to the high 20s, basically. But more importantly, you get this quantum superposition with this massive parallelism. So as far as brute force, and by the way, if you just go back to classical phase, when I first started talking about this in the 1980s, the AI people did not like me whatsoever because it showed that the goal line, if you will, for building a computer that would equal the brain, I'd push the goal line another 20 years. But even if that were true, that doesn't explain consciousness. I think you need some kind of, something funny like this quantum gravity mechanism to explain the hard problem.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all back for this new calendar year. Wish you a happy new year, and hope your holiday season was pleasant, relaxing, and joyful. Or if you were in a situation like mine where my in-laws came into town, I hope your return to work is pleasant and peaceful and relaxing. Okay, it's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome back a friend and colleague of many years, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, as this afternoon's Grand Round speaker. Stuart has a joint appointment as a professor in the departments of anesthesiology and psychology. He also serves as the the associate director of the Center of Consciousness, and he was one of the co-founders back in November of 1999. Additionally, he has organized several symposia titled Toward a Science of Consciousness, the Tucson Discussions and Debates, which have since, along with Al Kazniak of Psychology, been published in book form. He has additionally either authored or edited books on biomolecular consciousness and nanotechnology. These topics are additionally represented in numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals and also in book chapters. He is the organizer of the Quantum Mind 2003 Conference on Consciousness, Quantum Physics, and the Brain, to be held in March of this year. Is that going to be here on main campus? The Convention Center, okay. He was the leader of a prior internet course entitled Consciousness at the Millennium, Quantum Approaches to Understanding the Mind. He is the recipient of several grants from the Fetzer Institute, the National Science Foundation, and other groups to study consciousness. He also has attained celebrity status, having appeared
Maybe subconscious at one moment and manifest consciousness at another, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. Consciousness is really the tip of an iceberg. The problem of free will or non-computability, if we indeed have free will, I think we do. I don't have any choice but to believe that. And subjective flow of time in physics outside of consciousness, there really isn't an arrow of time. This is a very interesting problem. And I went to a conference about this in Europe, about the physics and geometry and psychology of time. And finally, the problem of non-locality spatially and temporally, if you believe in things like ESP and whatnot. And there are some interesting data about that. Well, the scientific study of consciousness sort of started a couple hundred years ago with phrenology, believe it or not. Francis Gall came up with this mapping of various properties inside our brains based on cadaver studies and then looking back at what the person was like historically. And it was the first attempt to kind of map function of the brain to, or map areas of the brain to cognitive function. And you may have seen cartoon takeoffs of this where a dog has a huge lobe for scratching and sniffing and rolling and bad stuff and whatnot. But this all stems from this fellow. Now, of course, we have our fantastic brain imaging techniques, and we are actually able to localize various functions. This is an image from the group at Irvine who studied PET and fMRI under anesthesia and awake patients and then sort of subtracted. And these are the areas they find that differ the most, thalamus and cortical projections, which goes with a lot of theories about thalamocortical projections being responsible for consciousness. But this raises a paradox because localization versus distribution. Stemming from phrenology, we know that, and now with a huge amount of evidence about focal deficits, specialized functions, hemispheric dominance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, specific functions are localized in specific regions of the brain. However, on the other hand, Carl Lashley, who set out as a localizationalist, if you will, trying to find the location of memory and other things, discovered that he couldn't and concluded that certain activities dependent on definite cortical areas can be carried out by any part, and that memory is distributed. It's all over the place. Now we know about neuroplasticity, global coherence, unity of self. Pribram proposed the holographic brain to explain this, and we have the binding problem of everything being bound together. So we have this paradox of localization versus distribution. We also have some other paradoxes, such as we know the brain utilizes both parallel and serial processing. And analogous to neural network computers, feedback versus feed-forward networks, hierarchical systems versus heterarchical systems, and bottom-up processes versus bottom-down processes, or top-down processing, excuse me. All of these things are going on in our brains. Now, a heterarchical versus hierarchical system might look something like this. This is from Crick and Koch, who have several interesting takes on the problem of consciousness. And it's a hierarchy, but with all this cross-connection, it's really what's called a heterarchy. And you can kind of summarize by saying everything seems to be connected to everything, almost. So it gets rather confusing. There must be some underlying order or principle, but nobody seems to know what. Well, how do we explain all this? There's a number of different approaches. Probably if you took a vote or a poll among scientists and philosophers worldwide, most would fall into A, which and I've merged actually several subvarieties: functionalism, computationalism, emergence. The basic idea is that the brain is a computer, that neurons and synapses act as bits or switches in a computer, and that through computational complexity and interactions among all these 10 to the 11th neurons, consciousness emerges as a novel property. Emergence is a term from nonlinear dynamics, which refers to the fact that you can get new properties.
In two BBC shows, a PBS show, the Discovery Channel, and in several documentary films. This afternoon, Dr. Hameroff's talk is entitled, How Does the Brain Produce Consciousness? Stuart?
Thank you very much, John. Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to address you, a group of psychiatrists who deal with the mind directly and kind of fine-tune it. As an anesthesiologist, I take a more blunt approach, you might say. So me talking to you is kind of like a house painter talking to a group of artists, I think. My interest in consciousness preceded my choice of anesthesiology, actually, and I've been interested in it for a number of years. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I think about it now. And I'm not going to start off by defining consciousness, although I think I will as I go along. There are many stories about conferences and talks where they set out to define it and wind up spending the entire time with a definition. So we'll just dispense with that, and I think you'll understand what I mean by consciousness, and of course, you know what you mean by consciousness. Anyway, David Chalmers is a philosopher here at the University of Arizona. He's probably the leading young philosopher of mind in the world. And he joined our Center for Consciousness group a few years ago and is a professor in philosophy. He's become famous for defining what he called the hard problem of consciousness, which is actually a restatement of an issue that goes back to the Greeks, but he did it very well and cleverly. Basically, first he starts off by the easy problems, which really are not so easy. The ability to discriminate, categorize, and react to environmental stimuli, the integration of information by a cognitive system, reportability of mental states, the ability of the system to access its own internal states, focusing attention, control of behavior, and the difference between wakefulness and sleep. And I might add, and the difference between wakefulness and anesthesia, which is different from sleep. If you're asleep and someone takes a knife to you, you're going to notice it. But under anesthesia, you wouldn't. Now, any of these, I think, aberrations of any of these easy problems would probably warrant a psych consult. And, but they're still relatively easy compared to the hard problem. The really hard problem, according to Dave and others, is that of subjective phenomenal experience. The smell of a rose, the sound of an oboe, the felt quality of emotion, and the experience of a stream of conscious thought. We have an inner life. We have something inside of us that gives us experience, and presumably robots and machines do not. As far as animals, that's another topic. I think they do, although it's certainly different. So this inner life, and philosophers describe this experience as being comprised of qualia. Qualia are sort of the raw components of conscious experience. It's kind of like a painter with a palette where the individual simple colors on the palette are the qualia, and he or she puts together to give a complex painting. So our complex, rich experience is comprised of simple, fundamental qualia. So you may see that word. And philosophers have also come up with probably hypothetical construct called a zombie, who is someone who may look and act like us but doesn't have any consciousness. And this is a useful philosophical tool. And Dave and I also developed the zombie blues, which is usually performed late night in the bars at consciousness conferences. Some of you may have heard it. Well, in addition to the easy problems, there's some other rather difficult problems. I mentioned the hard problem, number one. And there's also the binding problem. Why and how disparate brain processes are unified into single objects, a sense of unified self. If you look at an object, my finger, for example, there's different shape, color, meaning, and so forth. They're processed, presumably different parts of your brains, but it all comes together to tell you what it is. Similarly, there's only one of us, at least most of us have only one entity, conscious self inside of us, the so-called unitary self. Another problem is the transition from preconscious or subconscious processes to consciousness itself. The same brain regions